Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are happy to host you at our first webinar of 3 webinars titled China's and Russia's Aggressive Foreign Policy, Historical Legacy or Geopolitical Ambitions. This series of webinars are organized by the International Center for Defense and Security in cooperation with our Taiwanese colleagues at Institute for National Defense and Security Research. We are happy to have you in attendance in the most turbulent times, as Europe is in the midst of century's biggest security crisis. Estonia and its colleagues or other countries from the Central and Eastern European region have been warning about Russia's aggressive foreign policy for decades. We can say that in this field we have had a head start. Taiwan, on the other hand, has been aware of the potential security risks that PRC poses, not only to its security, but also to their rules-based world order. And I think in this field, both Estonia and Taiwan have a lot to learn from each other. This series of webinars is meant to facilitate the knowledge exchange and also best practices, how to deal with larger, increasingly aggressive powers and neighbors. And of course, in the midst of the war in Ukraine, increasing attention has been put on the actual cooperation between China and Russia. What are the limits? Are they really limitless, like they declare? And what is the actual substance? What are the actual fields of cooperation? As China's and Russia's actions, either in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe, have indirect impact on the world order, both Estonia and Taiwan have benefited from immensely. With the title, one of the aspects that I think has become important in the context of recent comments by the PRC's ambassador in Paris, questioning the legality of former Soviet republics, including Estonia. So one of the issues I think we plan to analyze and discuss here is what is the impact of Chinese and Russian aggressive foreign policy to the rules-based world order. And what does it mean not only to Estonia and Taiwan, but to Europe or the global security architecture in general? So without further ado, I will introduce our distinguished panel. Russell Hsiao is the director of Global Taiwan Initiative. He's also senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. And adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum. If audience has not yet read his co-authored work on PLA influence activities and political warfare, I highly recommend. This is a must-read in this field and highly valued. Next, we have Dr. Che-Chuan from our partner organization in organizing these events, Institute for National Defense and Security Research. He has a long career as a diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as a specialist at the National Security Council. And last but not least, Mr. James Sherr, our colleague from International Center of Defense and Security, leading expert on Russia and Ukraine, both in regard of security and foreign policy, with extensive career in advising Western governments in this subject matter. I myself, I'm Frank Jüris, research fellow at International Center for Defense and Security, and I will be moderating this event. So I will give the floor to James Sherr, please.
Frank, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important and unusual webinar, and I'm honored to be here for the first time with our, but not the last time, with our Taiwanese colleagues, and it will be interesting to me to see whether and to what extent our three introductions overlap, because my task is to talk about Russia's foreign policy, but particularly in the context of the Ukraine war, and explain what has led to that war. And that will lead to a discussion of why it matters and broader things. The war in Ukraine that began on the 24th of February last year has been called by many Putin's war. Well, there is some truth in that, because for a very long time, long before he became visible, Putin, even by Russian standards, has had very strong views, even obsessions about Ukraine. But in the main, it is not Putin's war. And what we see in Ukraine tells us a lot about Russian thinking about the wider world in general. The distinctive feature, in my view, of Russian imperialism, at least in a European context, is the absorption of the history and the identity of other peoples into Russia's own. The Habsburg Empire did not do this, the Hohenzollern Empire did not do this, but this has been endemic to Russian thinking, particularly where Ukraine is concerned. And even before the Russian Empire was formally established in 1721, the focus of policy as the Russian state, which for long had simply been known as the Grand Principality of Muscovy, the focus was to eliminate any divergence of practice and belief between Ukraine and Russia. When Catherine II, Catherine the Great, launched her war of conquest for what she called Novorossiya, New Russia, she declared one of her core aims as the elimination of the memory of the Ukrainian hetmanate, which was the political structure that had a predominant position on the territory of what we now call Ukraine at that time. In the 19th century, all of the assumptions and pillars of thought that we now associate with Putin with regard to Ukraine came into place at official level. That is to say, advisors of two Tsars, Nikolai I and Alexander II, set themselves and other Russian state intellectuals the task of drawing up an authorized history of what had been the territories of the medieval civilizational conglomeration known as Rus, and an official ideology. And in this, they defined who the Malorassiyske, the the Little Russians, the Ukrainians, were and who they were not. They progressively excluded the Ukrainian language from printed publications and discourse. They excluded and transformed all institutions that were in any way distinctively un-Russian. And all of this mythology about the origins of the Russian state from the time of the Grand Principality of Kiev have been taken over by Putin and modernized. But since the 19th century, it has been very difficult for Russians to view Ukraine as anything other than an extension of the homeland. So deep and profound has this experience been. And in fact, there is much in this 19th century writing that Putin actually just plagiarized himself, but it's very deeply felt. So that is one broader historical element of this. The second is geopolitical. Russia has virtually no historical experience of living with neighbors who are both friendly and independent. An independent state is seen as a potential or an actual enemy, particularly on Russia's borders. A friendly state is meant to be subordinate, or in today's parlance, to develop its statehood in cooperation with Russia. Now, I suspect our colleagues here will see some key points of commonality with Chinese thinking and practice, because there are strong elements of a tributary vision on the part of the Russians towards neighbors. What is also part of this is that in the Russian geopolitical tradition, there are certain elements of the grammar of Russian thinking. Spheres of influence, which is a term probably coined by the 19th century Russian foreign minister Gorchakov. Client states, buffer zones, defense perimeters, which are always on the external border of foreign countries, not one's own. And an enormous preoccupation with space. Security is seen as a function of space and who occupies what space and who doesn't, irrespective of the views of people who actually inhabit these so-called spaces. And these views have remained. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, in the first briefing given by the new Russian Minister of Defense to the Secretary General of NATO, he outlined this vision of Europe and security in terms of three spaces. The Russian world, the historical West, that is to say the old NATO, and a gray zone in between. So all of this has been antecedent to what we see today. And if it weren't for these traditions, the war that broke out in last year would have been impossible. But those traditions are not enough to explain why it actually took place, because wars are almost never the product simply of ultimate causes. They are the product of opportunity, pressure, and urgency. And 2020 and 2021 were crucial years from Russia's point of view. In the first place, all of Russia's efforts since 2014 to enlist the West as an acquiescent party to Russian demands to transform the post-Cold War security order are absolutely going nowhere. All of Russia's efforts to employ what I have called hard diplomacy and soft coercion to realign Ukraine away from the West towards Russia had failed. And then suddenly President Zelensky arrives. And not only in Russia, but in many other countries, Zelensky, who had no political experience, was an actor, was dismissed in Moscow as a clown and was assumed he would be very emollient. And in fact, when he arrived in office, His views about Russia were almost a blank slate. They were in many ways very facile and very naive. By the end of 2019, he had already learned a great deal and had become very tough. And this had a decided impact on Putin. I saw some of it myself. So this is one factor. And then in the midst of all this, and even before he arrived, all of the strength and position that Russia had acquired thanks to the 2014 war and the de facto control of much of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts had not altered Ukraine's trajectory of development at all. And not the least important factor was a decision by the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople in late 2018 to grant Ukraine, the Ukrainian Church, a tomos, that is to say, a status of canonical independence from Moscow, which the Russians took immediately as a political act, a hostile act provoked by the United States. So they were losing control of the situation, and they knew it. And everything they had tried to do before by covert and very clever means they realized had failed. And so they started to think in terms of what they called increasingly a different algorithm. And then we have, and it is always central to Russia, the internal factor. Lenin was not the first to say in Russia the distinction between internal and external affairs is without any proper foundation. On every occasion before, Putin surprised the West by forceful interventions abroad. I'm getting close. 2 minutes.
One left.
2 minutes. His popularity had declined and then was immediately boosted. And before this war, the immense popularity he had before the so-called Crimean Consensus declined. And that was a major factor. And add to that the threat of a colored revolution in Belarus, which was not only highly dictatorial, but seen as very stable. And one day you find out it wasn't. And the last point, my very last point, concerns the Biden administration, which is critical. Biden came to office announcing that America is back and it would no longer roll over. The Russians spent all of 2021 trying to explore what that meant. Is it really true? What does it really mean? And they came to two conclusions. On the one hand, the Biden administration is unwilling and unable to talk to Russia on Russia's agreed basis, which was a basis of restructuring the rules. The Biden administration was just trying to make the rules more palatable. But on the other hand, they, in a variety of ways, persuaded themselves, understandably, from the perspective of what they saw, that the administration did not have the will and did not have the means to oppose them. So by the end of the day, they reached a moment that we have seen in the history of other countries where they concluded that the dangers of war were less than the dangers of peace. And that is how we started. That is how they started down this perilous road. So I apologize for the extra time I've taken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, for an excellent introduction and explaining the thinking in the Russian Federation in regard of its neighbors, in regard of its spheres of influence. And I think this is a very interesting topic that might share some similarities in regard of Chinese way of thinking, especially in regard of Taiwan. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dr. Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. It is truly my honor to be part of the discussion today. According to what I was told, I'm supposed to talk about China's aggressive policy, harsh policy against Taiwan in the Xi Jinping administration, especially since 2016, when President Tsai Ing-wen took the office as the president of Taiwan. We know that since 2016, the regional situation in the Taiwan Strait has become very different, and the relations across the strait, of course, has turned sour significantly, and we can sense the pressure from the other side of the strait. That is for several reasons. The first one is that China has a very strong man, only second to Chairman Mao Zedong. And the second is that we realize everybody can see that Xi Jinping is pushing harder and harder for the realization of the so-called national reunification with Taiwan. So in the past 6 years, or 6 to 7 years, I think we can summarize what China has been conducting against Taiwan into 4 major points. The first one is politically and diplomatically. Beijing has been trying hard to isolate or stifle Taiwan. For instance, the cross-strait official dialogue and communication has been suspended since 2016, and Beijing has poached away 9 of Taiwan's diplomatic allies. So the total number of diplomatic allies has been decreased from 22 down to 13. And Taiwan has been blocked from more international participation in capacity as an observer. And a very important difference is that after Xi Jinping formally kind of bring about his so-called 5 points proposal for the Taiwan issues, so-called unification negotiation across the strait has been under the so-called one country, two system formula has been intensified, especially when after 2021, when Beijing, when its Taiwan Affairs Office increased its pressure against Taiwan by announcing several rounds of so-called list of Taiwan independence advocates. It is believed that they are trying to turn the competition between unification versus independence in Taiwan into a new one, which is pretty much pro-unification versus anti-unification, which has already exerted strong pressure within Taiwan. And the second point is that since 2016, China has been undermining Taiwan society by different kinds of gray zone tactics. For instance, China has been able to coordinate it or even supporting Taiwan's pro-unification political parties, and they can use the so-called vulnerability of a democracy to penetrate Taiwan's economy, industry, and society, trying to influence people on this island's identity and their trust of the government in Taiwan, and of course, undermine the social cohesion in Taiwan. And disinformation campaign and cyber attacks are other very important tactics. They have been conducting disinformation campaign on Taiwan, so that Taiwan has become the most the place most exposed to disinformation campaign in the world since 2000. China has been turning so-called economic enticement or economic integration with Taiwan into economic coercion. In President Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao's era, China has been emphasizing the so-called economic engagement policy with Taiwan. So they provide so-called economic benefits to businessmen and people on this island. And at the beginning of Xi Jinping's era, for instance, in 2014, they proposed that China would like to have economic integration with Taiwan. And since 2019, they announced several rounds of so-called preference policy to provide economic benefits or incentive for people on Taiwan, which includes so-called 31 points, 26 points, or 22 points. But we noticed that at around 2019, China stopped the so-called individual or free tourists coming to Taiwan. And at around 2021 and 2022, China imposed ban on Taiwan's agricultural products, aquaculture products, and alcohol for several rounds. And earlier this month, it also initiated a trade barrier investigation into Taiwan's so-called restrictive trade measures against China, which is believed to be tactics trying to influence Taiwan's upcoming presidential elections. And the last but not the least, I would like to talk about China's continuous and intensified military intimidation against Taiwan. At around 2015 and 2016, China began its so-called long-distance training and flying and cruising training by Chinese jet fighters and Navy vessels to conduct the so-called intrusion of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which already become a new normal. They intrude into Taiwan's ADIZ on daily basis. And later on, at around 2020, China denied the existence of the so-called median line in the Taiwan Strait, and they crossed the median line very often since 2021. And it is believed that this kind of military exercise or intrusion are actually part of their Guesong tactics, trying to pressure people on this island. And at the same time, they can improve their inter-service coordination and warfighting capabilities. And that has already changed the status quo in these regions. So even though we are not so sure about the highest ranking leaders are thinking about the possibility or about when and how to finish its national reunification missions, a lot of country in this world has already witnessed the very challenging situation in these regions. And I think Taiwan has been worked very hard and trying to collaborate with our like-minded country in this world, trying to increase, to strengthen our self-defense capability and hopefully to maintain the peace and stability in this region. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for a comprehensive overview of Chinese increasingly aggressive foreign policy, including pressuring Taiwan internationally, domestically, using economy as a leverage, tourist and agricultural products. These aspects of the PRC, we are just in Europe learning slowly about that one. Most recent case, of course, being Lithuania, first leaving the 16+1 format and then opening a representative office in Vilnius. One short remark, I encourage the audience already start posting the questions by using this chat function. We will have, we can follow with the discussions straight away. But without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Russell, please.
Thanks a lot, Frank. And really appreciate the invitation to join this very distinguished panel, whom I've already learned a great deal from, both James and Dr. Lee. So I think my role and contribution to the discussion will be focused on how the Chinese Communist Party is employing influence operations in an attempt to shape the policies in the United States as they relate to Taiwan, as the only US-based speaker here on this panel. I think the first step in doing this, though, is that we have to establish the baseline of US official assessments as they relate to CCP influence operations against the United States. So in 2019, the US Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that China is engaging in, quote, political warfare, end quote, against the United States, Taiwan, Japan, and other defense establishments of interest. In 2020, the US Department of Defense stated, and I quote, the PRC conducts influence operations that target media organizations, business, academic, cultural institutions, and policy communities of the United States, end quote. And in July 2022, the US National Counterintelligence and Security Center published an unclassified assessment which stated, quote, some of the goals of the PRC influence operations in the United States are to expand support for PRC's interests among state and local leaders and to use these relationships to pressure Washington for policies friendlier to Beijing, end quote. I think these efforts should be broadly understood as part of China's three warfare concept, in which the PRC seeks to leverage psychological warfare, public opinion warfare, and legal warfare to influence decision makers, shape public narratives, and spread disinformation to advance its interests. Now, before I go into how China engages in influence operations to influence US policy, I do think it's important to have a basic understanding of what US official policy and approach towards Taiwan are. First and foremost, the United States has a long-standing One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 US-China joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. This is the policy framework. The US opposes any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means. This is the approach. Consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, the United States makes available defense articles and services as necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability and maintains our capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercions that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of Taiwan. This is the means. However, the US One China policy has been quite ambiguous at best, and at points quite indecipherable. The policy has been shrouded in mystery, and this has created dangerous myths that makes the policy susceptible to manipulation and misapplication by Beijing in particular. For a long period of time, Washington has conducted its approach towards Taiwan and with regards to the international community, been manipulated by PRC's exploitations of the ambiguities in US position of not taking a position on Taiwan sovereignty and imposing its One China principle to delegitimize Taipei and suppress its international space. This had led, in part, to a gradual and excessive deference to Beijing's One China principle. Now, I think in the clearest articulation of the United States One China policy to date, and I would say that this was made back in 2004 by the then Assistant Secretary of State, James Kelly. And he stated, I can tell you what it is not. It is not the One China policy with the One China principle that Beijing suggests. And it may not be the definition that some would have in Taiwan. but it does convey a sense of a meaning of solidarity of a kind among the people on both sides of the straits that has been our policy for a very long time. I mean, to be clear, the US position has been intended to be purposefully flexible when addressing the relationship between the PRC and Taiwan. And to directly quote the Shanghai Communique of 1972, the US side declared, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China. Acknowledge, of course, does not mean the United States accepts or recognizes that position. I think it's important to note that in September of 2022, the US State Department made this explicitly clear. We don't take a position on sovereignty. Our one China policy has not changed. So the objective of Beijing's political warfare as it relates to Taiwan is aimed at broadening the application of its one China principle, while narrowly limiting the applicability of core elements of Taiwan policy, such as the Taiwan Relations Act, which I should note is the only legal basis of US policy towards Taiwan. 6 assurances, both in terms of the public mind and in how policymakers conduct policy towards Taiwan. So this political warfare campaign against Taiwan also extends beyond just US policy, but reaches all into international institutions, such as it relates to the United Nations, in terms of the application of UN Resolution 2758. Now, since its adoption in 1971, UN Resolution 2758 has been utilized by the PRC as a basis to prevent Taiwan's meaningful participation, both its government and its people, in the UN system without Beijing's assent. While UN Resolution 2758 did indeed dispose of the question of who had China's seat in the United Nations, the resolution itself makes no explicit mention of Taiwan, nor of the territorial or population scope of China. As Ambassador Robert O'Brien, the 28th National Security Advisor, and also the chairman of GTI's US-Taiwan Task Force stated, Resolution 2758 relates solely to the occupancy of the China seat at the United Nations, nothing more, end quote. This underscores, of course, Beijing's consistent distortion and misuse of UN 2758, as well as US policy, to serve PRC's interests. So with the remaining time, let me turn quickly over to how China is attempting to influence US policy towards Taiwan through influence operations in the United States. The CCP's United Front Work Department, of course, plays a very leading role in foreign influence effort. These are aided by other various PRC government agencies. The United Front Work Department coordinates and also conducts influence operations not only in the United States, but globally through front organizations. This is intended to build a coalition of political coalitions of social organizations that are mobilized to support PRC's goals. Among the other government agencies that are involved in foreign influence operations to include the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of State Security, Ministry of Education, as well as, of course, the Chinese military. Foreign organizations such as the China Association for International Friendly Contact, which is a subordinate to the Liaison Bureau of the Political Work Department of the Central Military Commission, is one example. The China International Cultural Exchange Center, which is under the Ministry of State Security, is another. And of course, the more popularly known and talked about Confucius Institutes as well. This is just to name a few. As noted earlier, the PRC's embassy and consulates also play the traditional role, as well as active support in such efforts, lending official support for United Front groups on college campuses, in some cases known and directing these student groups, such as through the Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, as well as Confucius Institutes on campuses. Of course, a key target of CCP United Front work is the Chinese diaspora community. In addition to recruitments by UF organizations, CCP controls many of the diaspora Chinese language media outlets abroad. This applies not only to the United States, but internationally. Another United Front organization is the National Association for China's Peaceful Unification. They've also been actively involved in the anti-Taiwan protest that has followed President Tsai Ing-wen's transit through the United States recently. To include other organizations at the subnational level, there are organizations that are actively involved in trying to court state and local offices and utilizing these subnational initiatives to try to apply pressure on Washington. And so that is an important way to how the PRC exerts influence. In cognizant of the time, I would just state that there are also city-to-city partnerships that that China utilizes through platforms like what I noted earlier, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, as well as creating dependencies with these subnational actors, as well as shaping policy through the business community. Well, I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Russell, for a detailed overview of both the organizations and the tactics of the PRC targeting the audiences, different audiences in US. And if I may, I will straight away follow up with the question. And of course, I encourage the distinguished panel and also the audience to already start formulating the questions. Just one aspect, there's been a lot of discussion about the coordination or cooperation between China and Russia in the war in Ukraine. As we have seen from the start of the war, that the Chinese different platforms have been sharing and using disinformation and helping in a way in this information warfare, Russian Federation. So the first question would be, what are the differences, what are the similarities between Russian Federation and PRC in targeting and how to say, formulating or manipulating the information space in their favor? Maybe James, I will give the floor first to you. You're muted, sorry.
I was reminded to say by Dr. Lee's remarks that there is one general commonality when it comes to disinformation between China and Russia, is that the main focus of it is to shape the narrative. And in Russia's case, the emphasis on shaping the narrative at this point is not focused inside Ukraine, it's focused on the West. In that it is of great interest to Russia, and they've had a lot of success with it, to get the West to accept Russia's historical framing of the entire situation and the relationship. The effectiveness of their information campaigns inside Ukraine has been in progressive decline. And I'll just mention one factor that might be of interest. There, for reasons I don't have time to go into, there have been in the past pronounced regional differences inside Ukraine with regard to attitudes towards Russia, with the most western part of Ukraine being traditionally hostile to Russia. The more eastern parts of Ukraine, although there was never a majority in any of these eastern oblasts to actually join with Russia or separate from Ukraine, much more favorable to Russia. After the war began in 2014, these differences dramatically diminished, but they were still there. Now you see something new because of the experience of war and occupation, that as you go east in Ukraine, you find more hostility towards Russia than in parts of Ukraine that have not experienced occupation. So it varies. So the information component is very high. May I just add one other factor? It goes beyond this. What China knew before the war began is a question I won't speculate about. Whether China wanted this war to start is also a question I won't speculate about. But what is clear is that, to my mind, and I would be interested if our colleagues disagree with me, is that it is very important to China that Russia not lose this war. Russia is very important to China to tie down US power. I do not perceive, and I would be interested in correction, that China yet feels that it has the capacity to be able to manage the global threat, as it sees it, of the United States on its own. And from that point of view, it is very much in China's interest that Russia remain a stable, functioning great power. And that gives it a direct stake in this war. Can't hear you, Frank.
Sorry. Mr. Hsiao or Dr. Li, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, Frank, I mean, I think maybe I'll just share a couple of observations with regards to the propaganda. I think one point to note is that cooperation has occurred even before the outbreak of the Ukrainian war, right? And there's been a number of these agreements that have been signed by the propaganda apparatuses between China and Russia before, again, 2022. And I think that there, any suggestion, and not that anyone here suggested it, that this sort of happened and as a result of the Ukrainian war, I think would be mistaken and led by the extent of the cooperation between Russia and China that started well before this. I think there is a internal dimension to how the PRC utilizes propaganda that I'm not aware of, at least in the Russian context, whether that is also the case. But part of that, sort of element of being able to cooperate on propaganda is also to be able to censor information domestically within China on any pro-Ukrainian or pro-Western, narratives, so that its own population become more radicalized in support of course, the Chinese allies initiative. In this case, the Russian, war in reinvasion of Ukraine. And so, what we saw at the outset of the war was that there was heavy censorship of, any pro-Western or pro-Ukrainian reporting as it relates to Ukraine. And so I think that was a very clear sign of how, Beijing supports Russia's effort. Perhaps, these cooperations on more sort of resilient and perhaps developed countries are not as effective, but I think we have to be also aware of and concerned by and realistically assess and not lose sight of, I should say, of how these narratives play out in the global South. Because while we might pay attention, say some may assess and say that such propaganda efforts are ineffective in our respective countries, they may not be as. They may be more effective in the global South, where such narratives, and that would matter in international institutions like the United Nations and others that would need the international support for condemning such atrocities. So, so I'll leave it there. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Li, would you like to add?
Yes. I'm not an expert in disinformation, but I think I can share some of my personal observation. In Taiwan, we tend to see that in China's previous disinformation campaign practice, it seems that at the beginning, China tried to imitate or follow the practice of Russians' disinformation campaign. And so we see there are so many disinformation fabricated or produced by the so-called Chinese content farm. But those disinformations were not that successful because it was not difficult for us to see, because we share the same language, but we have different kind of usage or terms. So it is very easy for people on this island to tell apart which one is disinformation campaign from the other side of the strait. So after the war in Ukraine happened, I think I can share two examples of Chinese disinformation. They are quite different from the previous manipulation. The first one is that the so-called skepticism on the United States support to Taiwan. At the beginning of the war, we sensed that there were information or disinformation actually spread out in a very fast pace. It turns out that at the beginning there were some people worry and spread their concern on social media, but later on China kind of used that and tried to modify a bit that the Biden administration has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and this time they are now going to assist with Ukraine. I mean, by physical forces. So people in Taiwan has to be very careful that the United States may have been just using you, and they will never come to assist when Taiwan have suffered from military attack from China. And the second case is that last year when we purchased the so-called landmine automatic laying system, which is looks like a tank. After we purchased that, similar disinformation campaign emerged, which says that government in Taiwan purchased that kind of weapons is going to kind of encourage, I mean, to bring about war across the strait, and not only our generation, but our second generation, the third generation on Taiwan would be suffer from those landmine, which is very difficult to remove. But actually, it is totally not true. Chinese information. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I saw James had a hand up. Please, James.
That's because I have a question for our Taiwanese colleagues. The Kremlin insists today that it is not Ukraine that is fighting, that Ukraine is a ward and satrap of the collective West led by the United States, and the war in Ukraine is therefore part of a broader hybrid war against the West. So in the Russian narrative, Ukraine and Ukrainians do not have agency. The real protagonist is the United States. My question to you is whether the Chinese narrative about Taiwan's defiance is similar to the Russian narrative about Ukraine's defiance.
Dr. Lee, you want to take that first, or you want me to share some of my personal observations on PRC's propaganda as it relates to the issue of Taiwan?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Oh,
sorry.
Russell, maybe you can go ahead, please.
Okay, sure. Well, so yes, James, I think there are some similarities but it is evolving to a certain extent. The longstanding sort of narrative on the PRC side with regards to its hybrid warfare against Taiwan and its sort of aggression with regards to Taiwan, both in its missiles pointed at Taiwan, its military exercises, which have increased in great intensity that Dr. Lee had referenced earlier, with regards to crossing of the median lines, as well as the highly provocative missile tests that occurred following Speaker Pelosi's visit last August, were all in the PRC's official narrative targeted at Taiwan independence forces. Right, so everything that they've been doing, from all the missiles that they've deployed, across the strait, have been framed in that it is these are not targeted at Taiwanese compatriots. These are targeted at the independence forces, within Taiwan. Now, there a subtle shift, but a notable one in recent years have been to also include external interference, right, by outside actors, and that's been more consistent in its overall sort of narratives in responding to the PRC in sort of justifying the PRC's actions with regards to its military aggression as well. So that's sort of how I observe the PRC's sort of narrative on Taiwan, which again, it's I think similar to what you referenced earlier in terms of how Kremlin's tried to sort of split, and that's part of the whole sort of united front tactic, which of course the CCP borrowed from its its Soviet its Bolsheviks. And as per and has deployed actually perhaps to a far more sophisticated and extensive degree now internationally, but that of course again intended to sow division and and amplify internal discord within Taiwan to essentially support the PRC's goals.
Dr. Lee, would you like to add?
Yes. Sorry that I just disconnected about 1 minute ago. For Mr. Sherr's question, my response is that it seems to me there are several different phrases or terms kind of quite popular in Taiwan. One term is the so-called Taiwan trap, which is essentially kind of a narrative framed by Chinese. They said that the current intensifying situation in the Strait has been very careful and well-designed, strategy or scenario manipulated by the Americans, which aims to kind of try to set China up to fall into the trap to start a military attacks against Taiwan. And the other narrative is that what I just mentioned about the skepticism about the United States, about the Americans, which says that the U.S. is just trying to use Taiwanese. They would not really come to assist with physical troops or kind of indirect military supports. But to me, I would rather stay with the third narrative, which is what I just mentioned in my presentation. What happened in the past 6 to 7 years, I believe, is pretty much a hybrid warfare or so-called Grasson tactics conducted by Chinese for the purpose of pushing further for the so-called grand mission of national unification. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see we already have first questions from the audience as well. Following up on this disinformation thread, our former intern Anniki Mikkelsaar has asked, what does the panel make out of Chinese ambassador to France, Liu Shaye's comments, which questioned Baltic states' independence? Does this reflect on even a stronger Chinese support now for an aggressive Russian foreign policy? I see James has a hand up. Would you like to go first? Sorry, you're muted.
wanted to come back very briefly to the comments of our colleagues on this last point before turning to Marco's question. This whole Russian theme that Ukraine has no agency, it has become just an instrument, an agent of the West, primarily the United States. I believe the main audience of that narrative is the Russian domestic audience. It reinforces this image of Russia surrounded by enemies who are trying to destroy Russia. And from what you say, I don't quite see the same perception on the part of Beijing in its disinformation. And there was another little nuance, because I believe that Dr. Lee mentioned at one point that one stream of Chinese disinformation is to try to persuade Taiwanese that the United States will not actually come to Taiwan's defense, that they will not do anything for Taiwan in the end. Well, that is the opposite of what they're saying in Ukraine. That you are fighting on behalf of the Americans. It's the Americans who are fighting to the last Ukrainian, because America is at war with Russia. So it's there's not a complete symmetry here by any means. These are still rather different situations. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
But James, comments on Anniki's question about PRC's diplomats or ambassadors?
Well, look, you can respond to this in two ways, both perfectly plausible. First, that the real reaction in Beijing to what the ambassador said might be he was a bit blunt, he was a bit radical, but of course everything he said about former Soviet countries not having real sovereignty is absolutely correct. But then there is another interpretation, which I now incline to, that they wanted him to make these very comments in exactly that provocative way, to see what the reaction would be, to stir the water and see who would respond. The fact that the Baltic states immediately responded, of course, stood to reason. But if the Baltic states are the only people who responded, that would tell Beijing something very important, particularly after Macron's visit to Beijing. And the interesting thing is that the Quai d'Orsay in Paris immediately responded. And I would say mischievously responded before the Élysée Palace, the presidential palace in Paris, said anything about it, which suggests to me that the foreign policy establishment in France was onto this gambit and knew exactly what needed to be done and did it very quickly.
Thank you.
Frank, I may just react to the question. Look, I think we have to take the leaders of China and Russia at their words. You know, I think the fact of the matter is that they have announced that they have a no limits partnership between China and Russia. They, Xi Jinping has met with Vladimir Putin recently, and in that very sort of orchestrated exit from their meeting, refer to such a historic juncture, if you will, in the international system. To the personal relationship that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have, where Xi Jinping has said before that he sees himself in a very similar fashion to Putin. And not to mention, of course, the Russian and Chinese defense ministers, well, the meeting of the Chinese defense minister and visiting. So I think all the signs are pointing to a greater support and alignment between Moscow and Beijing. Whether or not you believe that this is much more of a sort of a marriage of convenience or an alliance. I think the facts of the matter are that the Beijing and Moscow are increasingly strategically aligned, and this is, I think, very visible.
And if I may add, or I take the liberty as the moderator to comment this question as well. I think also it's very interesting to think about the timing of these comments. It was just shortly after President Macron's visit. And as we know here, 3 Baltic states all have left the 16+1 format. One of the reasons of leaving it was to have a unified stance or shared China policy. And Western bigger partners have criticized Central Eastern European countries for being part of this, namely the 16+1 format. So now what we have seen, Spanish prime ministers, German Chancellor Scholz's visit, Macron's visit lately, it is actually playing and using these divisions inside of Europe for their own benefit to make to muddy the water in a way. And make the divisions already existing, be it inside our countries or our societies or in our alliances, even greater. So they could play us against each other. But we have another question from the audience. This is directed to Dr. Lee. How might the different outcomes of Russia's war in Ukraine impact PRC's thinking and actions with regard to Taiwan?
I think the war in Ukraine is still there. We don't really know so far. It's the lessons for Taiwan is kind of positive. We all know that it shows us that the smaller power like Ukraine can resist stronger power like Russia's invasion if we are willing to defend ourselves, if we can fight asymmetrically. And with the assistance from like-minded country, we can sustain, we can fight longer. But I'm not quite sure if I comprehend correctly if the result of the war is different. Does that imply Russia turns out to be the one who won win the war? If that is the case, I think they would become an even stronger and louder alarms for Taiwan, which is that even if we have a Taiwan Strait lying in between, which is more than 100 nautical miles width, which can prevent the PLA from amphibious landing easily, but the lesson for Taiwan would be that authoritarian countries are kind of turned out to be able to coordinate with each other and continue their war long enough, which make the cooperation or collaboration between, democratic coalition or alliances, even not able to resist. So what we are already doing in Taiwan would have to to gear up. We have to work harder. For instance, maybe people in Taiwan have to think. Maybe the U.S. armed sales to Taiwan has to be delivered in a faster pace. We have to purchase more asymmetric weapons and to combine with asymmetric tactics and doctrines. And maybe we have to have more personnel in our army. Merely extended our mandatory military services back into 1 year may not be enough, which could be, longer. The suggestion could be longer, or even we could have more female soldiers and officers in our military. Thank you.
James, do you have a hand up? You're muted, sorry.
If I may just comment on the question that Dr. Lee answered. If Russia loses the war, it is entirely likely, perhaps more likely than not, and I mean conclusively loses it, that there will be internal repercussions in Russia, which is the last thing China wants, because it has a stake in a stable Russia, which remains a great power. So this is, I think, would be a deep setback for China. If Russia loses the war, it will also be seen, of course, in Russia itself, but I stand to be corrected by my colleagues, I suspect in China, as a victory for the collective West as well. And both of those factors inclines me to believe that with regard to Taiwan, it will make Beijing more cautious and at least push timelines back until there is greater clarity about what is going to happen in Russia, what the West is going to do. But if Ukraine, under Western pressure, is forced to conclude an infirm and fragile peace with Russia, and I assure you it will be both infirm and fragile and unstable, then I think China will only feel emboldened by this. Russia will feel very victorious, very confident. The regime in Russia will be strengthened, irrespective of what the costs have been there. Victory matters more than anything. The regime in Russia will be greatly strengthened. And I think, the repercussions then for Taiwan will be very bad. And my thinking on this, I think, is absolutely complementary with that expressed by Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, who of course went to Kiev the same day that Xi Jinping went to Moscow. He knows what he's doing.
Thank you, James. And if I may follow up on the topic of divisions in the societies and inside our alliances or our partners, I would like to address this question to Russell. As it seems right now, U.S. has a bipartisan support to a tougher stance in regard of China. Do you think this will hold, and what could the European partners learn from US, and maybe how could we achieve a transatlantic shared threat perception and maybe also clear policies in this regard? Thank you.
Well, I think on your second question, I think that will take a lot longer, in order to really force that sort of transatlantic alignment of threat perceptions. Although I think we're moving in that direction, right? And I think that there are greater calls within Europe that I think sees the rise of China clearly, and have also grown to recognize that many of the malign behaviors that the PRC has, employed, of course, towards Taiwan, more closely within its periphery in Asia, but also increasingly now targets, countries internationally in the West. And there is, I think, increasingly a shared perception that this is not a matter that is unique to just Taiwan per se, but also shared internationally as well. As for your first question, yes, I do think that there has been a real fundamental rethinking in Washington and in the United States as it relates to the U.S.-China policy. So much of the prior policy has been guided by an expectation that greater integration of the PRC international system would bring about, political liberalization and adjustment of its sort of practices and behaviors that it signed on to when it joined these international institutions. But really none of it has really borne out. And I think this sort of overdue course correction is a recognition that we have to deal with China the way it is and not what we hope it will be. And this cuts across, the political aisle with regards to Democrats and Republicans. And, you can see that there is a growing chorus of security experts and policymakers and lawmakers, recognizing that we are in a state of strategic competition with the People's Republic of China, and that China is the quote pacing challenge for the United States, and that and again, this has continued, from the prior Republican administration to now a Democratic administration, and I expect that unless the PRC's behavior changes, which I do not expect that it would, with regards to its malign international behaviors, that this course of action that we are starting to see will continue, obviously with adjustments in terms of administrations in charge, in terms of intensity, in terms of specifics of how to compete better with China. But overall, I think strategic competition is going to be the defining framework of how we describe the state of the bilateral relations.
If I may, one of probably the last questions for all the panelists, as we have seen, or deterrence in regard of Russian aggressive policy in Ukraine failed. What would be the lessons, and what could be done to avoid similar outcome in regard of Taiwan? One topic mentioned is shared threat perception, building stronger alliances internationally. What else could be done, in your opinion? Maybe Dr. Lee could go first.
Yeah, sure. A lot of people talk about deterrence across the strait. We know that it has been an extended deterrence with the assistance from the United States. But it's clear that as the PLA becomes stronger, especially its anti-access and aerial denial capabilities grow stronger, the conventional so-called deterrence by denial probably is no longer that credible. And that is the reason why I think a lot of American military leaders remind the possible military threat or possible military conflict could be imminent against Taiwan. But we work together to avoid another failure of deterrence. What occurs to me is that there are so many different methods to make your deterrence effective. For instance, there is one called deterrence by punishment. I think in addition from traditional military methods, the United States still is political or economic or technical aspects. So from what we already all know is that U.S. Trade war or tech war against China, especially the latter one, has won support from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Dutchland, which seems to me quite like a case of deterrence by punishment because of China's very assertive expansion. If that is the case, and that also could serve as a successful practice of the so-called integrated deterrence initiative by U.S. Secretary of Defense. So I think maybe that is a methodology Taiwan can follow, and of course the like-minded country can do. Thank you.
Thank you. Russell, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think the point I would like to make is that I think in the United States and among like-minded partners and allies, we have to think more holistically about deterrence and think about it not only in military terms, but also economic and political terms. I understand that, here in the United States, and perhaps internationally as well, with rightful skepticism, that economic measures alone failed to deter, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I don't think that means we should dismiss that as an important, if not critical, element that can tip the balance in how Beijing could be deterred from launching a destructive invasion of Taiwan. I think, despite, of course, the size and integration of the PRC in the international economic systems, but this arguably makes Beijing actually and the Chinese Communist Party more susceptible to the political effects that a well-coordinated sanctions regime, as well as other inbound and outbound control measures that are implemented systematically over time and signal clearly, can affect the political calculus of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think there are real significant vulnerabilities in China that are perhaps less are less apparent in the Russian case. And so I would, I think, encourage all sort of policy analysts and strategic thinkers to continue, I think, our efforts to think about this element of deterrence in how to really effectively deter Beijing from, deciding, if whether to invade Taiwan or not.
Thank you, James, please.
I'm sorry we don't have half an hour to discuss this very important question, but we don't. Both China and Russia inherit Leninist military and security cultures, and it's very important. We do not. And that's why we so often, as the Biden administration did with Russia in 2021, get our signaling wrong. Both put enormous emphasis on what is the Russians call the moral factor, meaning they understand that strength is not purely or even primarily a function of how many aircraft carriers you have on the ocean or how advanced your aircraft are. It's about your own willingness to accept risks, to make sacrifices in order to achieve your stated national security goals. And if you are not perceived to have that kind of strength, then so much of what we emphasize will be discounted. So I wish we'd learned this lesson at some point, but it's very difficult for us. I was at a top table lunch after 2014 in a national security establishment of a NATO ally, where someone said to me, "What are you worried about, James? Our combined GDP is 20%. It's 20 times greater than 20 times greater than Russia's, which was then a bit of an exaggeration." And I said to him, "War is not won by GDP ratios." So, you know, there are these other factors that are of enormous importance, particularly to the Chinese and Russians. Secondly, it's very important, if you're dealing with either Beijing or Moscow, that our words and our capabilities and our actions are connected. If they are in contradiction, then we will not be seen as serious, and the threat we pose will be diminished in their eyes. And the third, my last point I'll make, it's very important to know when we are being tested and how to respond when we're being tested. And we use the example, the supposedly innocuous example of the Chinese ambassador in Paris, and what he had to say. And I'm very grateful, at least on this occasion, that Quai d'Orsay in Paris knew Europe is being tested. They're trying to see who reacts, and if nobody reacts, then it suggests to them, particularly after the Macron visit, as you mentioned, Frank, that we really have a good opportunity to cause divisions in Europe. So I think all these factors matter very much in how we play, in our foreplay before a conflict in Taiwan.
Thank you. Last words also on this deterrence topic. I'm afraid both PRC or China and Russia see the collapse of the Soviet Union as a mistake for the different reasons. Also, they share the opinion that the war in Ukraine is caused by NATO's expansion. We don't share this agreement. And what is most alarming from the Putin and Xi's meeting in Moscow, that they both are supporting each other in driving the changes unforeseen in a century. So my proposal for deterrence is, let's win the war in Ukraine so we don't have to fight a one in Taiwan Strait. Thank you all for your contribution, your interesting thoughts and discussion. Thank you for the audience for the wonderful questions. I hope to see you all in little less than 1 month in the second webinar of the series. Thank you all and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.